Interestingly enough, Ahmed Hajjaj will be released from federal authorities on March 1st after serving 6 months for his passport fraud, just 3 days after the World Trade Center bombing and 3 days before Mohammed Salameh's arrest. Hajjaj was rearrested 8 days later on March 9. Some sources had alluded that he had been picked up somewhere in New York, but the truth of the matter is that he made his way back to Houston, Texas, where he was apprehended. He was eventually charged for the bombing on May 6, 1993.
A sixth suspect is now charged in the World Trade Center bombing. Ahmad Hajjaj will be arraigned this afternoon in Manhattan federal court. He faces charges of conspiracy. For the past 2 months, Hajjaj was held without charges as a possible suspect in connection with the February bombing that killed 6 people.
A worldwide hunt is on today for a 6th suspect in the Twin Towers bombing, and there are also reports of a possible motive for the bombing. Does this look familiar? It's a scene eerily reminiscent of the crater formed by the bomb at the World Trade Center. Actually, it's the El Rashid Hotel in Baghdad after it was hit by a U.S. missile in January. CBS News is saying that it was in retaliation for that incident that the bomb was set at the World Trade Center. Meanwhile, more information is coming out on the new suspect. He's identified as an Iraqi, 25-year-old Ramzi Yousef. He came to the U.S. via Pakistan back in September. He reportedly did not have a visa and asked for political asylum. He failed to show up for a hearing on his request last week. Yousef once lived in the same Jersey City apartment building as the first suspect arrested, Mohammed Salameh.
And only yesterday, the head of the FBI's New York field office, Jim Fox, told me about a 6th man now being sought.
Ramzi Yousef is the so-called sixth man that the press has been talking about for some days. He is charged with participating in the bombing itself, not simply aiding and abetting the bombing. We've been looking for him for a number of weeks without success. If I had to guess, I would guess that he is overseas by now and that that's where he will be found.
Let me throw out a few seemingly unrelated facts. Fact. Back in the early 80s, one of the pillars of U.S. foreign policy was something called the Reagan Doctrine. It was designed to counter communist gains in the Third World. It was why Washington supported the Contras in Nicaragua and Muslim fundamentalists, the Mujahideen, in Afghanistan. Fact. 2 years ago, when U.S. armed forces first bombed and then invaded Iraq, the FBI here at home significantly beefed up its surveillance of suspected or potential Muslim terrorists. Fact. Immediately after the bombing of the World Trade Center, initial speculation focused on Serbian suspects, so that when the New York Daily News, the day after the bombing, got this particular phone call on one of its news tip lines, no one paid any particular attention until weeks later, just a couple of days ago, in fact.
Hi, this is the Liberation Army. We conducted the explosion at the World Trade Center. You will get our demand by mail.
And then, of course, you're also aware that a letter subsequently came to the New York Times. That letter claiming that the motivation for the bombing was American ties with Israel. And that letter said at one point, Israel is responsible for terrorism against Arab citizens all over the world. Now Americans must see what it feels like to be the victim of terrorism.
At first, there were 5 to 7 different groups and organizations that took blame for the 1993 bombing, but eventually it was discovered after his arrest that the chemical engineer Nadel Ayad was the one who made the call, taking claim as the Liberation Army. But we will re-examine Nadel Ayad's letter and the reporting of Ted Koppel and ABC Nightline investigation on the 1993 Ground Zero about the FBI beefing up its surveillance during the first Gulf War in 1990, as well as the pretext instigation with Iraq and Ramzi Yousef.
With 4 conspirators now in custody, authorities decided to bring them to trial while the search for other bombers continued. In February of 1994, a year after the bombing, the trial concluded. The jury forewoman read off 38 pronouncements of guilty: conspiracy, explosive destruction of property, interstate transportation of explosives, and murder.
It was the worst act of terrorism on U.S. soil, and an angry federal judge called the men convicted of carrying it out sneaks and cowards. Nothing more, nothing less. Judge Kevin Duffy handed down the same sentence to all 4 men, 240 years in prison with no chance for parole. Although they could appeal, it is my intention, said the judge, that you stay there for the rest of your life. It is what government investigators had wanted.
I think it's very fulfilling to see this kind of a sentence handed out by the court.
Each of the 4 convicted men, 3 Palestinians and 1 Egyptian, delivered long, rambling statements about how unfair and unjust they thought their trial had been. They were convicted on 10 counts of planning and executing the World Trade Center attack. That explosion 15 months ago killed 6 people, including a pregnant woman. Her husband asked the court to give his wife's killers the maximum sentence.
I don't think words can put on, you can use any words to say what you lost when you lost your wife and an unborn child.
The judge levied a $250,000 fine on each of the men and ordered that any money generated by book or movie deals would go to the victims' families. But he added, I can't picture anyone giving you anything.
Mohammed Salameh, the chemist Nidal Ayad, Ahmed Ajaj, the man who brought the bomb manuals into the country, and Mahmoud Abu Halima, known as the Red, will spend the rest of their lives in prison. The mastermind, Ramzi Yousef, and his accomplice, Iyad Ishmael, were still fugitives.
Authorities had no direct evidence linking Ibrahim al-Gabroni to the World Trade Center bombing, but he remains in prison for assaulting an FBI agent. However, he will reappear again in the narrative, as will these court cases before sentencings. Later that year, before being charged, Ahmed Ajaj and Bilal al-Qazi were not adapting too well to incarceration.
2 suspects in the World Trade Center bombing reportedly have tried to kill themselves with razors and a noose fashioned from torn bed sheets. A defense attorney identified the 2 as Ahmed Ajaj and Bilal al-Qazi. The lawyer said the suicide attempts came Thursday night in separate cells at the Manhattan Correctional Center.
The following year, Bilal al-Qazi would end up plea bargaining guilty for immigration fraud, where in turn, the government dropped the 7 conspiracy charges against him connected to the bombing. According to the New York Times, July 14, 1994, J. Gilmore Childers, an assistant United States attorney, said that while the government believed it did not have sufficient evidence to convict Mr. al-Qazi in the bombing, there was still enough evidence to show that he was involved in a conspiracy of terrorist acts other than the one that accumulated into the deadly bombing of the World Trade Center, which killed 6 people.